Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 456. This program is in merit of Baruch ben Yomen ben Menucha Lana and Miriam bas Chaya Sarah Altois, Yekusil ben Leah Rachel and Rachel bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Toders ben Miriam and Sarah bas Rachel Altois. So today we can say Good Yom Tov, being that it's Yud Gimel Tammuz, which together with Yud Beis Tammuz, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz, is the Chag HaGeula, Chag HaSimcha VaGeula of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Yud Beis Tammuz was also the Frierdiker Rebbe's birthday. But Yud Gimel Tammuz, together with Yud Beis Tammuz, is considered the Geula. Why? That's the question. Why is the Geula of Yud Beis Tammuz celebrated also on the next day? The technical reason is because when the sentence of the Frierdiker Rebbe was commuted from exile to total freedom, it was a legal holiday in the former Soviet Union. So the legal, technical getting the papers that freed the Frierdiker Rebbe came the next day. And therefore, the actual Geula was on Yud Gimel Tammuz. But Yud Beis Tammuz was the designated day. Again, it was pushed off due to the holiday. But everything is Hashgacha Pratis. The fact that we call Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz the Geula, you have to say, not just because of some Soviet technicality. So most likely, I've never heard the explanation by the Rebbe, maybe the Rebbe did speak about it, but most likely the thing that most jumps out is based on a question that the Rebbe asks about Yutas Kislev. The famous letter after the Alter Rebbe came out of prison, he wrote to his mechutin and colleague, Lev Yitzchak Baditchev, he wrote a letter about today being the Geula, and that's when I said, Padav Shalom Nafshi, is when I heard the news that I'm being freed. And then he says that today is the day that Le'ena Kol Ha'amim V'Chol HaSarim, and the eyes of all the nations, of all the ministers, they saw God's hand. Of course, the question is, Yutas Kislev is a Geula of a Rebbe. Spiritually, it was the vindication of the spreading of Chassidus Chabad that the Alter Rebbe had begun. So why is it relevant to know that the Amim, the nations, the ministers? And the Rebbe explains, because the kavanah of spreading Chassidus and spreading Torah in general is not just for the Jewish people, it's to transform the world. So when the world recognizes that significance, it's part of making the Dira B'Tachtenim, of transforming this very material world that the world itself recognizes. So in that sense, even though you could say Torah is higher than the world. Alpaim Shana Kodma Torah Le'elam, the Torah precedes existence. We're above existence. But yet we need to transform existence. So when the Geula of Yud Beis Tammuz was a similar idea, as we discussed last week and elaborate a bit more now as well, it wasn't just that the Frierdiker Rebbe was freed from all the accusations. It opened a new tziner, a new channel, as the Rebbe explains, that we can overcome any challenge when it comes to spreading Torah and Yiddishkeit and Chassidus. And even a mighty empire that was such opposition, especially coming from the Jewish enemies, as the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, that they come to recognize that no, the Frierdiker Rebbe prevails. So therefore, the fact that the legal holiday of a country like that affected the Geula actually turned the Geula into 2 days instead of one. The Geula came the day of Yud Beis Tammuz, but the actual when the papers were delivered, even though you could say that's just a technicality, no. It means that even from the legal perspective of this Soviet Union, in all its darkness and all its vicious cruelty and oppression of Jews, also in that legal system was recognized this day of Geula of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Whether they knew it or not, on that level is irrelevant. Just like the ministers may not know all the significance, but they saw it. And it became part of a legal process, even in such a cruel empire like the Soviet Union was at the time. So it just emphasizes for us the lesson. What does that teach us? It teaches us that no matter what the circumstances, it's not just two tracks. You're a Jew at home, and then you have to deal with the secular world in the street. No, it's one Hashem Echad. There's one God everywhere. And even in the darkest of the dark, you can also find godliness. In a famous sikh that the Rebbe delivered on Shabbos Parsha Chukas, connecting to Yud Beis Tammuz, Tov Shem Mem Ches, the Rebbe speaks about the Eneid Malvade, famous story that when the Frierdiker Rebbe left prison and went to Kostroma, officially for the first 3 years exile, and then that was commuted, so Mechol Dvorkin and Chassid went to Kostroma and he was making somersaults and singing and dancing with the niggin Yet Net Nikava, Kromi of an Adnava, which means Eneid Malvade, basically. Nothing but God. And the Rebbe asked the question, how's that connected to the Geula? Because that was the Geula. It's to reveal Hashem Em as the truth of God, not just in a Beis in a shul, a Beis HaKnesset, and a Beis HaMedrash, not just on Yom Kippur, not just in Eretz Yisrael, not just by the Holy of Holies, but in the very darkness of the world, in the abyss itself, to also recognize that everything is Hashem Echad, and that even they are recognizing they had to release Him. So making it as part of that, so even the legal system of an unethical empire, let alone one that is based on the laws of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Neach, recognizing divine truth. So it's a lesson to all of us, no matter where you are. It's about finding the God within everything, the godliness within everything. That's the ultimate message of Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. Why does the Frierdiker Rebbe write that this was the Geula for all people, not just for him personally? Or someone else puts it this way: did the Frierdiker Rebbe once say that his liberation at Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz was not only a personal liberation for him, but it was Hashem giving the energy of the liberation to everyone in the community? How exactly do we receive and harness this energy? Is it in a similar way when one family is celebrating a simcha, and the whole community comes and dances at the wedding and feels the joyous energy together with the family? So let's take one at a time here. The Frierdiker Rebbe absolutely said it, wrote it in the letter, the classic famous letter, the first year, Tezvav Sivan, the day he was arrested. A year later, Tofresh Peches, he writes it in a letter, Lo Oisi Belvad Gol HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not I alone did God redeem on Yud Beis Tammuz, but everyone who loves and cherishes Torah, B'chavei Torah, Shemri Mitzvah, and even a Jew, Yisrael, that Rak B'Shem Yisrael Yechuna. That is just his name, or nickname. He doesn't see it as a primary thing. It's just a name that he's called. That means the entire spectrum. And we discussed why. Because the Geula Yud Beis Tammuz was not a personal matter. Why was he arrested? As he writes in that letter, because of the Malshinim, about those that informed on him, who hated and despised the spreading of Torah. They could not deal with it. They couldn't tolerate it. So the Geula is in that matter. It was a matter of that they were that their resistance was overcome. So now the celebration is of Arbotzas HaTorah, that who prevails? The spreading of Torah, even more than before. And that's something that every Jew, and that like the Frierdiker Rebbe says there, even a Jew, because everyone's Tomim Libay, his heart is completely connected to Torah mitzvahs, even if he may not be aware of it. As in that Sikh and Chukas, Tov Shem Ches explains the connection. That it's not just that everybody deep in their heart connected, that the Geula helps them connect no matter what the concealment may be of the animal soul. Yitzrei Husha Onse in the language of the Rambam, the end of chapter 2 of Hilchos Gedushin. Whatever it may be, it ultimately, the Geula itself broke open the door that no matter what the resistance may be, whether it's from without or within, whether it's the enemies outside or the enemies within, Torah mitzvahs vanquishes, prevails every negative force. So in the context of the next question, how exactly do we receive and harness this energy? So the Frierdiker Rebbe continues. That therefore this day, and Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, designate for a time of Hisedus and Hisvadiyas, a day of inspiration, awakening, stimulating ourselves through a Farbrengen, coming together, celebrating in unity, and taking on resolutions in what? In Arbotzas HaTorah, and spreading Torah. Indeed, in that year, Tafresh Peches, the first anniversary of Yud Beis Tammuz, the Frierdiker Rebbe gave out a mimer, to learn Torah together in a unified way and increase in our commitment to mitzvahs with kavanah, davening, and of course spreading harbotzas satera, because that's the essence of the whole geula. The golus, both the imprisonment was trying to prevent that, God forbid, and the geula is making it blossom even more. And the Rebbe explains that's why we see after the Beis Gimel Tammuz, the harbotzas satera of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and that would then of course only accelerated afterwards, coming to America, and then the Rebbe, Tovshin Yud and on, has only grown, blossomed, and branched out in both quantity and quality in unprecedented ways. That's how we harness this energy. Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, Moed HaMoedim, the holiday of holidays as it's called, gives us that power. And it's not just a family celebrating another family simcha. First of all, our Rebbe is not just an individual, he's a neshama klolis, hanosi hu akel, so his simcha is all our simchas. But here we have an additional, the whole geula was not a personal thing. Even though there's no real things as personal of the Rebbe, but relatively speaking. It was about his communal activity, his global activities of spreading Torah. So it's far more than just that, than a personal joy, even though obviously Simcha Vonid is a Simcha Volid. And of course all this gets accentuated by the fact that Yud Beis Tammuz is also the Frierdiker Rebbe's birthday. Mazole gave it special energy that gives that power, the power of a birthday of a Rebbe. Another question regarding Yud Gimel Tammuz, or in general Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, can you please ask Rabbi Jacobson to give a brief synopsis of the Maimer the Frierdiker Rebbe said in the main synagogue in Moscow, which caused agents of the Yevsektia, that was the Jewish communists, who were secretly listening to the charges against the Frierdiker Rebbe, which caused them to get arrested and ultimately freed on Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. Thank you. Yes. So the Rebbe speaks about this as well. Famous Maimer, V'kibala Yehudim Tofreish Pei Zayin. This was Purim Katan. That year was a Shana Muberes, a leap year. And Purim Katan, the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Moscow, and he delivered a Maimer, a big classic Maimer. It's printed today in Sefer Maimorim Tofshin Yud Aleph, of course also in Tofreish Pei Zayin. The Rebbe has footnotes to it. And in this Maimer, the Frierdiker Rebbe speaks about many subjects, but the main thing is the power of children. Power of children. A little background. When word got out that the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to deliver a discourse in 1927, in the throes of the darkest moments, when they were doing everything to oppose and to try to stop the Frierdiker Rebbe from doing his holy work, and remember at that point he had already appointed secretly the 10 Krisas Bris, a minion with the Frierdiker Rebbe, 9 and the Frierdiker Rebbe. Frierdiker Rebbe said, I called in Junge Light. That will be Moshe Nefesh to the last drop of blood to continue to maintain and perpetuate and make grow Yiddishkeit despite all the decrees and all the close downs and all the challenges that the communists were fighting actively against all this Yiddishkeit. So he was saying this Maimer. So when word got out, spies were sent to hear what the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was told that spies are coming to listen and see what he's saying, and it could have grave consequences. The Frierdiker Rebbe said the Maimer, and in it he speaks about the Gzeira time of in time of Achaz, that what happened was that they closed down the shuls and they closed down the schools, similar to what the communists did. And yet it was the voice of the Tanekah Shel Beis Rabbi, Mepi Eilim v'yenkim Yesada Te'ez, Lahashbis Eiv Misnakim. Frierdiker Rebbe declared, from the mouths of babes, of sucklings, will come Yesada Te'ez, the foundation of Eiz. Eiz is Teira, Ein Eiz El Teira. Lahashbis Eiv Misnakim, to eliminate, annihilate, obliterate Eiv Misnakim, the enemy and the ones that are taking the vengeful ones against Teira and mitzvahs. And that's where he put so much focus on the education of children. And this was, of course, the biggest thorn in the eyes of the Yevsektia because they wanted to close down the whole thing. And children were the future. That was indeed the battle. So the Maimer is a lot about the Mesiras Nefesh of Mordechai, of Purim, Maimer of Purim Katan, the Mesiras Nefesh, that Mordechai went and gathered the children to say Psukim, and that was the way, that was a big force that ultimately destroyed and overturned the Gzeira of Haman, Oyev Misnakim, the enemy of the time. It was very clear that Frierdiker Rebbe was describing the situation then in 1927. And this is one of the factors, maybe the final straw that got them, that they finally felt that they have to eliminate this enemy, quote unquote, enemy, the Frierdiker Rebbe. And in turn, of course, was the exact opposite. He was arrested, but what happened? He was vindicated. He won over, exactly like the same story. So this only emphasizes not just Harbotzas Torah in general, spreading Torah, but also especially the education of children, who are the guarantors of Torah, because they are the future. So that's part of this discussion, and part of the significance and lessons we learn from Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. As we go into the summer in this part of the world, children are going to camps, and other ways that they're being educated. So this just emphasizes Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. There's a strong critical emphasis we have to put on focus on the children being inspired with passion in Torah mitzvahs, because this is the power from Elim v'Yenkim, even from the youngest age, to eliminate any enemy, any adversity, and on the contrary, to transform them all into positive forces as we march toward the Geula. So that is covering Yud Gimel Tammuz. Let us now go to Parsha Pinchas. So the Rebbe, many sichos, connects Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz to Parsha Pinchas, because it always comes in that period from Chukas Balak into Pinchas. What's Pinchas? Pinchas is the kanoi. He didn't just follow the law, he went beyond the letter of the law to sanctify God's name. Exactly what the Frierdiker Rebbe did. There are a lot of things the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't have to do. But he felt in a time of Gzeira, a time of Arkasa de Mesana, a time of when there was so much pressure and efforts to obliterate Yiddishkeit, God forbid, he went over beyond the letter of law in challenging it. I remember one Sikha when the Rebbe spoke, beautiful Sikha, I believe it was in Tov Mem Gimel. No, actually Tov Mem Aleph, Tov Mem Aleph, 1981. The Parasha Chukas. Chukas is also about L'mayla Meseichel, Chukah, Mesiras Nefesh, and said that when the Frierdiker Rebbe was told, Gimel Tammuz, that he can go to Kastrama, he asked, when will we arrive by train there? So they said, after Shabbos. He said, no, I'm not going to leave. Now we all know, Pi Halacha, that if you go and start traveling a few days before, you can travel on a train. And especially, Pekuach Nefesh, Reiche Kol HaTeira Kula, it's Pekuach Nefesh Mamish. One more day he stays, anything could change. And yet the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't go. And the Rebbe explained with the story in Parsha Chukas, with Moshe, because a Moshe, a leader, everybody's looking at. He understood what they wanted. That people would say, oh, the Frierdiker Rebbe went on a train to save himself. Even though if halachically you can find Hatarim and explain it, but a leader is on the highest standards. When the Moshe Rabbeinu just changed one word, instead of speaking to the stone, he hit the stone. That was considered something grave for a Moshe. Every little subtle thing, when the eyeball, a piece of dust on the eyeball is very irritating, not like a piece of dust on your finger. So the standard of Kiddush Hashem for a leader is far, far higher, and the Frierdiker Rebbe exhibited and demonstrated that same type of total. He said when he went into prison, I will not compromise anything. He went beyond. Now usually you say, okay, in a situation like that, let me try to make it as easy as possible. No, the exact opposite. For his own pride, for his own connection to Hashem. So the attitude of Pinchas that you have once in the Torah, a person, he saw God's name desecrated, God being desecrated by Zimri. Kuzbi, what did he do? He didn't ask questions. He just went ahead and did what he had to do. We discussed other times how he's allowed to do it. There's discussions about that, whether he established a Sanhedrin. Some say he did that. Kanoim Pegim Bey. But you see that Torah does not necessarily advocate zealotry, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the first lesson we learned from Pinchas, what is the general lesson from this chapter? That there are times you have to have that type of Mesiras Nefesh. We're not talking now going sparing people, God forbid. We're talking about in positive ways, where you don't just do the minimum, but you go the maximum, especially when there's a challenge. When there's some gzeira, there's something that decrees. Today, thank God, we don't have such gzeiras. We can learn Torah, teach Torah, send our children to school, to Jewish schools, Altaras HaKedesh. But still, everyone has their moments where there's something that, the clip of our times, it could be materialism, could be prosperity, comforts. So now you have to go and say, yes, these comforts, great blessings, but don't ever let it cause you to be apathetic. You have to go to war against apathy. And that's the idea of a zealot, a kanoi in Gedusha. That's lesson number one as we learn from the Frierdiker Rebbe. Is there any room for zealotry in Judaism? So you could ask the question, is there any room for zealotry? Someone writes this question, are the people in Israel who throw rocks at cars on Shabbos emulating the zealotry of Pinchas? And if so, should they be rewarded with priesthood as Pinchas was? The answer is absolutely not. First of all, as I said, Pinchas was an exception, and he was actually a man of peace, not a man of aggression. That's why he got the Bris Shalom. God gave him the covenant of peace. It seems like, is that commensurate to what he did? Because it wasn't coming from zealotry, it was coming from devotion to God. So you have to be very careful where you cross the line from devotion to God and your zealotry. There he was, Bekanes Kanesi, he took on God's cause. And you don't find ever again that you see this as a path. Zealotry is always rejected, if not outright crime. Take the law in your own hands. It doesn't work that way. Pinchas he had a Bezdin, he had other ways that he was able to do it. And regardless, it was an exception. So zealotry is Judaism? Yes. You know what? In Ahavas Yisrael. You want to be zealous? Take the biggest mitzvah of all. Rabbi Akiva says, Ahavas Yisrael, Zeh Klal B'Teirah. This is the fundamental principle of Torah. Hillel says it, Zui Kol HaTorah Kula. This is the entire Torah. Don't do unto others that you don't want done to you. V'idach Perusha, Zil Gemer. The rest is commentary. You want to be a zealot? Take Ahavas Yisrael, find every Jew you can meet, and show them extra love. Extra Avos Chinam, extra love in ways that are unconditional love. Doesn't have to have a reason. I remember someone who came to see me. He was looking to raise money for a mikveh or a kollel in Meir Sha'arim. He was dressed like a zealot and talked like one and spoke like one. The whole works. He wanted to mention a few names of people he heard that I know, but would I introduce him? So I said, who are you? So he started telling me. He called himself a Charedi, a Kanoi, he called himself, which is a zealot. So I said, in what part of Torah are you a zealot? And he looked at me like, isn't it self-understood? I said, no, I'm not sure, which mitzvah say you a Kanoi? Clothing, how you dress, length of your payas, what exactly? She started telling me, what are you talking about? Torah, mitzvahs. So I said to him, what about the mitzvah, the biggest mitzvah of all? He said, which one are you talking about? Ahavas Yisrael. Started dismissing that. I thought I was making a joke. I said, look, I understand you think you're a Kanoi. If you could show me Kanois in Ahavas Yisrael that you're doing, I'm happy to introduce you to anyone. I'll even go with you. He was so not bedara doing it. He was so completely didn't know what I'm talking about. Like by him, Kanois would be things that are, I guess, shiurim, measurements of tzitzis, tznius issues, things like that. But you say this, I didn't know if you could apply that. So I'm not here to be critical. It's not a Lashon Hara thing. I'm not saying names. But sometimes you have to understand Kanoi is Kanoi. You want to be Kanoi in Avos Hashem, absolutely, Yiras Hashem. Not Kanoi in other people's cheshbon. People zealot about other people, judging them, expecting from them, demanding from them. That's not what a zealot is. That's not what Pinchas was. Zimri did something which was a grave crime. A leader should stand up and desecrate God in such a way publicly. He wasn't talking about Zimri's going around. You don't find that Pinchas was going around looking at every person's details of their lives and saying, I got you. Definitely not throwing stones at people who drive on Shabbos and so on. So basically, Ahavas Yisrael is where zealotry should be directed and guided. That's where real Kanois is, if you want to be a Kanoi. In general, the Rambam says the way is the Derech HaMitzua, the middle path. Not extreme right, not extreme left. Except if a person has gone or too extreme one way, sometimes you have to go to the extreme the other way to balance out, to get back to the middle. But if you really want Kanois, there's plenty of areas where we can show love to the people that we should show love to. Go out of our way. Lefnim Meshurus Sadin, Milsa de Chasidusa, Midas Chassidus, a Chassid that goes Lefnim Meshurus Sadin. And Alter Rebbe was asked, how do we know that? So he brought the raya from Gemara, that it says, when cutting one's nails, a Rasha just throws them out, which is a sakana for somebody in certain situations to walk upon, so he doesn't care. A tzaddik, it says, buries them, so nobody shall walk on them, but it can still be dug up. And a chassid serfon, a chassid burns his nails. Now, burning a part of what was once part of you is also a sakana to you. But when you burn it, no one else can be hurt. So he's ready to forego his own comfort, his own convenience, to make sure that nobody else will be hurt. That's a chassid. So there's plenty to go in the Frim Rishur Sadin in that kav, in that direction. Okay. Next question. What was unique about the complaint by the daughters of Tzlofcha that Hashem granted their request, unlike other instances when people complained? What was different about the complaint by the daughters of Tzlofcha that Hashem and Moshe agreed with them and granted their request, unlike in many other cases where people complained and Hashem got angry at them for complaining? So he sent plagues of snakes to bite them, like in Parsha Chukas. Was it perhaps because the daughters of Tzlofcha had lodged their complaint in a respectful manner instead of how some others complained by wrongfully cursing Moshe or inciting groups to mutiny as Korach did? As we have been taught, parts of Korach's argument were valid, but his application of his ideas were wrong. I'm sure it would have worked out better for Korach if he went to Moshe's tent respectfully and said, Hashem made you and Aaron leaders, and Hashem knows what he's doing, and I'm not challenging you, but I have a few philosophical issues about equality that are bothering me. Can we please sit down and have a cup of coffee and friendly conversation about my ideas? I won't take much of your time. I know we have to be up early tomorrow to pack up the Mishkan and move to our next camp. Is one of the lessons of the story of Tzlofcha's daughters perhaps a teaching about how to complain in an appropriate manner? I think it's very well stated. I think a very balabatisha, practical approach. There's no question that there's definitely a lesson in that. That's not only what you say, but it's how you say it. And if Korach had indeed done that, he had questions. Torah is given to learn. If you have a question, you absolutely have to ask. You accept what the ruling is in, but nevertheless, let's understand it. And that was indeed not what Vayikach, Vayispaler Korach, as the Targum translates, that he took and challenged Korach. He went to war, rebelled, and incited others. So that's for sure one of the basic answers. And the same thing you see in other situations as well. Even then, Moshe Rabbeinu did not stand up. He fell on his face in humility, and then the whole process for Hashem to demonstrate who he wants as leaders. Because Moshe took ala nizik fa nigzim in Hashemayim. And the person who's receiving, even if it's coming from a bad place, he has to look and say, what does it mean for me? There's something here, and I need God to reveal to us that we indeed are doing the right thing. But in addition to that, you find like Tzlofcha also by Pesach Sheni, the Loma Nigora, that came from the anguish of their heart. When it comes from a sincere place and is done respectfully, that's when Hashem responds. If you're doing it in an arrogant way with wrong intentions, you don't feel the anguish of the heart, it's a whole different story. So obviously it's case by case, but clearly it came to the Bnei Tzlofcha, and similar to the people who were said that they were Derech Rechek or Tmeya, Pesach Sheni, they were both granted. And we learn much from that, of how our prayers can change things above. Like in those cases, something new was added. A Pesach Sheni, Chalukah Sa'aretz to the women, the daughters of Tzlofcha. Yehi Rotzen, it says, when we daven, you can create a Rotzen Chodosh, a new desire, a new change in God's plan. How that creates change is a discussion. Sefer Ikrim Chassidus brings it. It's not for now. But the point is, yes, there is a way. Moshe Rabbeinu did it also. He did it respectfully, but very firm. You could say he had chutzpah when he stood up to God after the Chet Egel and said, I want you to forgive them. And if not, erase my name. And before that, he broke the tablets. That we'll talk about soon. So you see there are ways and there are ways. So very good points. And thank you for that. You see it also among humans. When you come to something, let's say you have a complaint or you have a question. If you come to someone with a grievance and a complaint in an angry, aggressive way, usually see what happens. Come in a pleasant way and say, I saw this, I have a question. Respectful, and so on. You get a different response. It's all about the words from the heart enter the heart. And the main thing is to get the ego out of the way. Get your ego out of the way. You have a question? Fair, good question. It's not about you, it's not about the other person. Let's not personalize it. Okay, one more question and discussion in Parsha Pinchas. What do we know about Joshua, the assistant of Moshe Rabbeinu? Was he considered a tzaddik? Did he write any books of chidushim on the Torah? Or was he chosen as the new leader due to his military experience? So in this week's Parsha in Pinchas, we find that Moshe says to Hashem, we need to appoint my successor. And that's when Hashem says to take Yeshua, Samach and Moshe ordained him, preparing him to be the leader after they would come to enter Eretz Yisrael. So a lot is talked about Yeshua. Chassidus brings from many different places. It's also brought in Kabbalah and B'chlal and Svardim and Farshim. You look at Yeshua, you see two stages in his life. The Lo Yomish Metecha Eil stage, where he never separated himself. He never left the oil, the tent of Moshe, referring to his total and utter dedication and devotion to Moshe Rabbeinu as a student. In that sense, I'm a Kabul, complete recipient. He wasn't mashpia at all. Then comes stage 2. After Moshe's passing, Achri Moshe, it says, then he became the manig and the mashpia, the next generation. Moshe Kibul Teinu Sinai, Umesarali Yeshua. Yes, with the ordination of Moshe, but now Yeshua is now the leader. And he has the power of Moshe within him, as the beginning of Yeshua tells us. And that came his generation, the next generation to continue. So now he's a mashpia. Chazal tell us Moshe is kipnei chama, Yeshua kipnei levana. Moshe was like the face of the sun, and Yeshua was like the levana. So Moshe, in the language of Chassidus and Kabbalah, Zoh, Moshe, and Malchus is Yeshua. Malchus has 2 levels. When Malchus is makabel from Zoh, from the mashpia, like a student who's turning and receiving from his teacher, absorbing. Then comes stage 2, where he processes and begins to be mashpia, Malchus, as it comes down into biyah, the language of Chassidus, into the lower worlds. So each of us begin by first being a talmid, a student. Then what's expected is that the student should become the teacher of others. Not just to remain, but maintains the bittul. But now when you become a teacher, there is a certain, I would call disconnect, is sometimes the word used in Chassidus. I'm actually teaching about this now in Ayin Beis. And this is a good opportunity to invite you all to my daily Ayin Beis class. Go to ChassidusApplied.com or AyinBeis.com. You can find all the details. So we're learning mamash about this. It's based on a maimer of V'norim b'mishnah Yiniginosam that the Alter Rebbe said at the wedding of his grandson, Baruch, son of the Mittler Rebbe. It was a Sunday night during the year Tovkuf Samach Ches, essentially the equivalent of 1807, around Parsha Vayetze time. Be essentially October, November. And powerful Maimer talks about these 2 levels. The Malchus and Moshe, in Yeshua rather, and explains a lot of different verses about Yeshua, but especially the ones that we're learning now. So these are 2 stages. And then Yeshua wants, even as he's mashpia, he wants to always reconnect to the Moshe. And that's why the Malach, the Satzva Hashem that Hashem sends to Yeshua, that he receives, to help reconnect to Malchus as it is in Atzilus. That Malchus and Biyah connecting to Malchus and Atzilus, as he explains there. So in that sense, that's a brief summary of Yeshua's role. We also know Moshe prayed for Yeshua when he went as the Meraglim, and his name itself has the words Yeshua and Yehoshua, Yud-Kei, and so on. So you see that connection. He was considered a tzaddik, absolutely. He's considered a Rebbe. He's considered a Nossi, a leader. Did he write any books of Chidushim on the Torah? Well, the Torah is, at the time, Torah Shebiksav was the only thing written. It was by the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Yeshua, there's a whole Sefer Yeshua. Different opinions who wrote it, but the bottom line is it's a Sefer Yeshua. So of course, then they weren't publishing books, but they were writing and teaching Torah, and Yeshua, Mosarli Yeshua. Moshe Kibul Torah Sinai, who did he give? He's the next in line. And Yeshua Liskenim L'Neviim. So you have the unbroken chain of the Messiah. So that's no question. He had military experience, but that's not the main reason. A Nossi, a Rebbe, is not based just on certain military experience. It's based on his bittul. Like we said, Lo Yomish Metecha Eil. And Samach Yodov, Moshe ordained him, put his hands on him, transferred his power to him. The power of Elokus that traveled through Moshe into Yeshua. Okay. With that, let us move to another thing. This week is also going to be Shavos B'Tammuz. 17th of Tammuz. So 17th of Tammuz, of course, is marked with a fast day, commemorating the 5 terrible events that happened, as the Mishnah in Tainus tells us, beginning with the breaking of the tablets. The breaking of the tablets. Now, when Moshe comes down from Har Sinai from Mount Torah, 40 days later, sees the Jews had built a golden calf, and he shatters the tablets, Shviras Haluchas. Then he marches back up to ask forgiveness for them. Rashi at the end of Chumash says, from Medrash, that Hashem says, Yeshekechach sheshivartem. When it says, L'chola eses va'amefsim asher osa Meisha, le'enei kol Yisrael, the end of Torah, to all the miracles and wonders and signs that Moshe did before all the Eden, what does Rashi say? Shviras Haluchas. And Hashem says, thank you for breaking them. It's a classic Sikha, Simchas Torah Tov Shemem Zayin. Never forget it. The Rebbe crying that night before Hakofis, explaining, what is this Rashi saying? Of all things, Moshe took the Eden out of Mitzrayim. Kriyas Yamsuf, Matan Torah, 40 years in the wilderness. Breaking the tablets is the Eisus Mefsim. And when you finish the Torah with this, Torah should be finished, Messiah B'Tev. And in general, Shviras Haluchas is we fast because of it. It's considered to be a sad day. What does it mean? Hashem is saying thank you. And briefly the Rebbe answers, because Moshe breaking the Luchas was not a desperate act. It wasn't a tantrum, God forbid, of anger. It was very deliberate. Moshe knew what it says in the Luchas. Lo yeh lecha lekim acherim. You should not build a golden calf. The Eden had heard this 40 days earlier, but they had not received the tablets. They hadn't signed the contract. The ksuba was not delivered yet. So as a good shadchan and also a good advocate, he was preparing the ground. He's saying, yes, they heard it. And they said, yes, they said, hein and lav, the different opinions. They accepted it, but they didn't get the ksuba yet. So he kept that as an argument to Hashem to forgive the people. So Moshe was doing it out of tremendous Avos Yisrael, bigger than everything else, because there he sacrificed himself. And the Luchas, breaking the tablets. A Sefer Torah is considered to be a tragedy if it falls by accident. And here to break the Hashem's Luchas, the Luchas that Hashem carved, that Hashem shaped, the Luchas themselves, the first Luchas. But that's the Avos Yisrael. So that's where you see what a real Nasi is. So Shivasa B'Tammuz has this paradox. On one hand, yes, we fast, because the break of the tablet is still a negative thing. But the deeper cause and deeper purpose is like we lay. You have chiyam meil l'sasan l'simcha l'maydim tevim. To be transformed, not just to be eliminated, to be transformed to maydim tevim, because then we see, once the love is established, Yom Kippur comes, you suddenly realize the inner power, the inner love that was established after the so-called break, after the betrayal and the violation. The love much deeper, Yom Kippur, the Luchas Shniyas, even greater than the first Luchas. So that's a tremendous lesson in life as well, when negative things happen. Now, the main thing that we consider Shivasa B'Tammuz, I don't know if it's the main thing, but it's one of the 5, is the breaching of the wall. The walls around Jerusalem. In some opinions, it happened in both temples, both the first and second temple. The first by the Babylonians on the 17th of Tammuz, and the second by the Romans. There's an opinion the first was not the 17th of Tammuz, the breaching of the wall, even though Tisha B'Av was the destruction in both temples. What's the significance of breaching the wall? It's only a wall. But a wall is asusi yoglateta, the walls that we build around us. You don't start crying, you don't start worrying once people break into a house. You worry once they break through the door. They're protective walls. And the same thing in our psychologically and emotionally and spiritually. We have walls around us. And as soon as there's a breach of the wall, there's an issue. But the word is v'samach melech bavel, samach. Samach also comes from the word support. Again, the paradox. On one hand, it's a breach. On the other hand, that breach can be turned into a support. Had the Eden done Shuvah, everything would have been reversed. And the walls would have become stronger. So it's about also protecting not just our lives and our children's lives and our families, but also protecting the walls that surround them all. And that's the extra measures we take. You don't just protect the child, you protect all the different factors to make sure you never have to come to a problem. Like think of the very physical body. The fact that we have skin and hair and outer layers protects from infections getting into the body in the first place. So the walls have to be always protected. The walls are the hidurim, the specific stringent guidelines that we follow, that not necessarily is a mitzvah in the Torah, but it protects the mitzvah. You shouldn't even come to a situation like that. You preempt the problem. You don't wait till the problem has already become a monster. So that's one of the tremendous lessons in Shavasha B'Tammuz. Okay. And that's why is it important to mark this day, and what lessons does it have for us today? So we just answered that question, that it's about understanding it's not just an event that happened back then, it's events that are happening all the time. And the lesson for us today, we spoke about two of them. Number one, the depth of love that any negative experience brings out. And number two, protecting the walls, protecting the environment, protecting the being on the offense and not waiting to be on the defense by establishing and making sure our walls and are in place. And that simply means, let's say, for example, in marriage, you don't have to, it's not just about the love between two spouses, it's also making sure that the environment is trusting. And not to do things that potentially can be problematic. Not just not do something that's problematic. Be extra careful, extra sensitive in the environment and the people that come to your home and to other activities that you're doing, that nothing should ever blemish or in any way compromise the integrity of a marriage. Same things with parents and children, same thing with friends, same thing in Yiddishkeit in general. That's why the Chacham did make siyagim for that reason. So when you love someone, you don't just watch out when there's danger, you just make sure you create all the right guidelines and the right checks and balances to make sure everything is intact. Okay. Being that we're talking about Shavasha B'Tammuz, which of course is a result of, on a spiritual level, deeper things. When we say the breaking of the tablets, right away reminds us of other breaking. What does it remind us? If you learn Chassidus Kabbalah, Shviras HaKelim, the shattering of the containers. Though that's not a physical thing, but it's still shattering. So a question came in, what do we know about, please clarify the relationship between concealment, tzimtzum, and the shattering of the vessels or containers, Shviras HaKelim. Thank you so much. So briefly put, when we talk about Eirei Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum, we have a seamless, complete, absolute divine consciousness awareness. And there's no room for anything else. Ein Eid Malvadeh. Elokus b'pshittis is the expression. So there, of course, there's no room, there's no independent consciousness, there's nothing else but godliness. Hoya, Ashlei Nivra Elam, Hoyahu Shmei Balvad. Him and his Shemai, as Chassidus explains the levels, what Shmai means. Oyer, the higher levels of Oyer, different levels of Oyer. But bottom line, it's all godliness. So of course the Eibishter can do what he wants, but he wanted it to be in a way according to the seichel that he himself created. So he made it tzimtzum. In order to create how could you have tachtenim, as the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 36 in Tanya, tachtenim begili eid in Sofis baruch, which means the helam. Tachtenim doesn't mean lowest physically, but it means lowest in divine revelation, where there's no divine revelation at all, to the point that the world can say aniva afseid me and nothing else. How's that possible in the context of Elokus b'pshittis? So the Tzimtzum explains that. That Tzimtzum that Arizal explained. Concealment, like a teacher concealing his infinite brilliance to allow room for the student. Now the purpose of the Tzimtzum is not an end in itself. Purpose is like the father hides from the child, so to elicit the ingenuity of the child to find God there. Famous examples in Chassidus. But what happens if a child stops looking? So the concealment can lead to all the other problems. Ultimately, the Tzimtzum will lead to Shviras HaKelim. Shviras HaKelim means a dissonance between the divine energy and the containers. Because now there is a second state of consciousness, independent consciousness, Kelim. But initially there's tremendous tension between the two. I sometimes explain that the way to understand it is like a market correction. Shviras HaKelim is almost like the protest of something's wrong. What's wrong? That the divine is concealed. Yes, the Kav and the Eir is very intense and very powerful, but it's not completely compatible with existence, and that's why there's a shattering. It's like when things are not working in a person's life, something's going to give, something's going to break. But it's Seisalam Nas Livnis. The Shviras HaKelim is meant to bring together, like we spoke before, that the shattering only brings out deeper love, ultimately, the Yom Kippur. So the shattering of the Luchis can be compared to the shattering of the Kelim. Obviously, it's on a lower level, meaning it's happened on earth. Shviras HaKelim is more on a spiritual level. But it's associated with it, and the goal is ultimately not to remain shattered, but to use the shattering, the broken heart, to create something even more complete. There's nothing as complete as a broken heart. So that's briefly an explanation of that. Let's move now to a few questions, and then I have a lot of Gimel Tammuz follow-up. A lot. About the Rebbe, about our time, and I'm going to try to cover it because I know these questions are very relevant and really bothering a lot of people. So, let's use our time wisely here. First, I'll deal with two questions that came in that I thought appropriate. And this is a good opportunity to invite and welcome your questions. We have a forum at ChassidusApplied.com, completely anonymous, can be traced, so please feel free to write there. You could add your name or email if you like, especially if you want us to communicate with you. But you could also write completely anonymously, which is what we prefer. And as well as other resources, our archives and other resources you can find at ChassidusApplied.com. So I will get, Mr. Hashem, to every question, but give me the time because more questions are coming in than that time allows to answer. So we have a backlog, but I try to keep it either focused by theme or things that seem timely and so on. So, question came in about this. Should I be living out of town? Dear Rabbi Jacobson, I lived in Brooklyn most of my life, but I never felt that I fit in, and I was just spinning my wheels and not growing. 3 years ago, I moved away to a small town upstate. I was attempting to utilize the teaching of the Torah that says if you change your place, you change your mazel. Yes. Shana Mokim Mishana Mazel. I also wanted to live in a different manner where I was a big fish in a small pond instead of a small fish in a big pond. And everything changed for me almost overnight. I met someone and got married. I settled down, bought a house. I haven't got a parking ticket in 3 years. My life changed for the better. But this week in your Ayin Beis class, you taught that the Rebbe Rashab, while explaining Seder Shtalshelus, says it's better to be the tail of a higher level, the Zon of Larayas, tail of a lion, than the head of a lower level, Reish L'Sholem, the head of a fox. I feel since Crown Heights is the Rebbe's community, is definitely on a higher spiritual level than my current residence. And when I was living there, I definitely felt low, like a tail, instead of how I feel now, like a head. I want to be in alignment with the Rebbe Rashab's teachings, but there's no way I will move back to Brooklyn because the noise and traffic damage my inner peace and make me angry, and that's not a healthy way to live. Please advise how I can live in alignment with the teachings of Chassidus, but remain ahead of a lower level. Thank you. Okay, interesting question. I'm sure many people have this question. So I mentioned before the two levels of Yeshua, two levels of Malchus. But remember something. Let's have a conversation with Malchus of Atzilus. Malchus of Atzilus, when it's in Atzilus, it's in heaven. No pun intended. It's completely absorbing, receiving. Less Lamaga Maklum has nothing of its own. It's completely absorbing what its teacher is teaching. Yeshua, lo yomish metechael. Not a mashpia at all. As the Rebbe Rashab writes in another Maimer, Kenai Yisrael Samach Vov, famous Maimer, that this was, we heard from the Samach Tzedek. That's how the Samach Tzedek said that. He was not a mashpia at all, complete absorber. Beautiful. Mamish by the Rebbe himself. So then why does Malchus come down into Biyah? And for that matter, Neshama in heaven is also delightful. Yofer sha'achas be'elam haba, shel kedes ruach be'elam haba. 1 hour of pleasure in elam haba is worth more than all the pleasures of this world. So why doesn't Neshama come down? And indeed, al karcha chatachai. It's forced to come down. Malchus has to go into Biyah because there's something to be accomplished. It's true. In Giluyim, in Revelation, Malchus is higher in Atzilus. When Yeshua is by Moshe, of course it's a higher level, higher connection. But the kavanah is to come down. Nuach la'adam shalei nivra mishanivra, Shammai says, and that's the halacha. It's better, more pleasant not to be born than to be born. But that's nuach. The Alter Rebbe explains pleasant, but kavanah, meaningful, is to come down. So Malchus has to now take the energy that it received and now become a teacher. That's the whole concept of shlichus, to be a shliach and not just stay near the Rebbe. And Yeshua has to now become the leader after the passing of Moshe. So I would say not just because of the traffic and the parking tickets and the noise, you have a shlichus where you are. Oh, you should not come back to Crown Heights. It's not what the Rebbe wants. He wants you to be there. Bring the energy of Crown Heights that you've received there. So when it says in the Mishnah, Le'elam Yehei Adam, Zonav Larayis, Yehei Adam Zonav Larayis, V'al Tehei Reish L'Shoalim. So how does it consistent with this? Because there he's talking about, number one, the first stage is you have to first be a Zonav Larayis, meaning a makabel. And secondly, even when you become a Reish L'Shoalim, you have to always remember the virtues and the qualities of being connected. There was a shliach, early years of a shlichus, he couldn't stand being away from the Rebbe physically. So he would come in every few weeks. One day, Rabbi Chadakov calls him in, the Rebbe's chief of staff, and says, "You were sent on a shlichus. Why are you always here?" The Rebbe wants to know. He says, "That's where I get my chayas from. I come here to shep chayas, to draw energy from the Rebbe. Then I go back to the shlichus." So Rabbi Chadakov said, "Your job is to be there and bring the Rebbe's energy there." So okay, he had a directive. For months he didn't come, maybe a long period of time. One day he gets a call from Rabbi Chadakov and says, "The Rebbe is asking why he would never see you." So he says, "What do you mean? You told me to be here." He says, "Yeah, be there, but your heart has to be here. And from time to time you have to come to demonstrate that." So it is a dual paradox, if you wish. So the mission is focusing on the value of always being a makabel, a talmid chacham. Not a chacham. A talmid, you're always a talmid chacham. Zon of larayis, you're a makabel. But in the kavanah is you have to go and be a reish l'shoalim and bring there that energy. And that's why Yeshua ultimately, through the Malach, as he explains in Ayin Beis, bridges the two. So I hope that was helpful. One other question. Should I indulge my family with materialism for the sake of shalom bayis? Maybe it's not usual, but I don't have a taiva for being mamala taiva. It doesn't have a desire for fulfilling desires. Sometimes in the moment something comes up and I give in, but I definitely don't have taivas on a calendar. Taivas are desires. My wife, on the other hand, likes the finer things in life. Besides for the fact it's out of my budget, part of me recognizes that I need to make a keli to expand the budget. Yes. Not only does she like the finer things, but she wants me to enjoy it with her. It's almost like if I don't come to enjoy the experience, then we're losing out on her interest being met. But at the same time, I'm simply not interested in the food activity, nor am I particularly dying to spend more time with her in that kind of environment. Is there an inyan for me? Is there a reason for me to cultivate a desire to spend the time with my wife enjoying taivas better for the sake of an improved shalom bayis? Well, I don't know the details. Oh, firstly, I want to just say, when I hear the tone, sounding almost like she's a Baal Taiva and you're not, I wonder if we looked a little closer if that is indeed the case. So, people, you may think you may have taivas in one area, that you are minimizing. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying I don't like that juxtaposition it rubs me the wrong way, to be honest. And because of that, I start wondering, was it this materialism of your wife and you're more spiritual? Or is it that you have other interests? So if you're saying you're a tzaddik or a beinani and she's a rosh of a tevle,